Great. So thanks so much again for the invitation and for the warm introduction. So the title of my talk today, it's based on the paper in Race and Justice, and it's called Making Gideon Count, Public Defender Resources and Felony Case Outcomes for Black, White, and Latinx Individuals. All right, so just to preview, I'm going to get into some background and sort of what's motivating this work, but just to preview kind of the research questions that I'm going to tackle. First are public defender caseloads associated with felony case outcomes for Black, White, and Latinx individuals, as well as whether their caseloads are associated with racial and ethnic disparities in sentencing and pretrial detention. And second are whether support staff caseloads and support staff, I'll get into more detail about what, who falls under that label, but just some of the people that fall under that label for the purposes of the study are social workers, investigators, paralegals, etc. And are their support staff and are their caseloads associated with the same 2 points: felony case outcomes overall across different racial groups and disparities across racial and ethnic groups. Yeah, so those are the general questions I seek to answer, specifically focusing on overall associations between caseloads, as well as whether caseloads differentially impact certain groups of individuals who are charged with crimes over others. All right, so moving on to the motivation. So just big picture, you all are probably pretty aware, and I'll go over this pretty quickly, but the United States is unique in the extent to which it relies on incarceration to deal with social issues. This graph's actually a bit dated, but we still have the highest incarceration rate in the world. So not only do we incarcerate more people because we're a large country than other countries, but we also incarcerate a larger proportion of our population or percentage of our population than any other country in the world. And when you compare us to other countries that are advanced democracies like us, the differences are quite staggering. So if you compare us to even a country like the United Kingdom, which has, for an advanced democracy, a high incarceration rate, we're incarcerating people at about 5 times the rate that people, or 4 to 5 times the rate that people in the UK are being incarcerated at. So the differences are really stark. We weren't always like this. The big kind of shift started in the mid-1970s, around 1973 and 1974. This chart just shows how we went from incarcerating fewer than 200 per 100,000 people to incarcerating, by 2010, more than 700,000 per 100,000 people. So our incarceration rate basically quadrupled over a 40-year period. A big feature, in addition to the growth over time, is that we have massive disparities in incarceration. So this just shows incarceration rates for Black, Latinx, and white individuals. And what this chart shows is that for Black people, the incarceration rate is about 6 to 7 times the incarceration rate for white people. For Latinx individuals, they're incarcerated at rates that are about 2 times the rate of white individuals. So there are disparities there as well. Something else to note, though, is that even though there are massive disparities, and those are critical, our system has captured a lot of white people too. Which you can't do this, but let's say if you just look at the white incarceration rate, it would be among the highest total incarceration rates in the entire world. The white incarceration rate's about 500 per 100,000 people. If you were to go back to our chart earlier, very few countries, there are maybe like 3 countries that have incarceration rates for their whole populations that are as high as our white incarceration rate. So we have massive, massive disparities, and Black and Latinx individuals bear the brunt of it. But even white people have gotten tied up in the system because of our punitive sentencing and punitive punishment apparatus. So one thing you might wonder is when we look at sort of the shift in incarceration over time, one might think maybe we're just responding to crime trends. This chart really shows that that's not the case. So the red line here is incarceration over time. The other lines, the blue, green, and purple, are different types of crime rates over time. And as you can see, at first, when incarceration started to increase in the 70s, crime rates were increasing. But beginning in the early 90s, crime started to go down pretty significantly. And it's continued to go down up until the last couple of years. But incarceration continued to skyrocket. So you can see here that sort of the red line continues to go up as the green, purple, and blue lines continue to go down, right? So clearly, our incarceration policies are not just a reflection of crime rates. Studies have estimated that basically at most 15% of the growth in incarceration is due to changes in crime rates. So in short, we've engaged in different practices and policies that have led to a more punitive and incarceratory system. So one thing that's sort of interesting to kind of note, and it shapes part of my research agenda, is that addressing the issues of incarceration rates overall and disparities are not necessarily the same thing, and if you address one, you won't necessarily address the other. So if you look at this chart here, it might be a little difficult to see, but the darker the colors are the larger black-white disparities. So what you see here is that some of the states with the with the highest disparities between black-white incarceration rates actually are places with the lowest incarceration rates overall. So a place like Minnesota has a black-white incarceration ratio that's of more than 10 times. So Black people are more than 10 times as likely to be incarcerated as white people, but it's actually one of the states with the smallest incarceration rate or the lowest incarceration rate. Then you see states like Louisiana, for instance, which has, I guess now it's the second highest incarceration rate, but for a long time was the highest incarceration rate. It has among the smaller racial black-white incarceration disparities. Right, we see the same thing for Latinx white disparities as well, where states like New York, for instance, which has a relatively low incarceration rate, has among the highest incarceration disparities here. Same with Connecticut and Vermont and Massachusetts. But other states in the South, for instance, that have higher incarceration rates have lower Latinx white disparities. So what this suggests to me is, what can we do to reduce, this led to kind of a key question that I seek to answer in my research broadly, is how can we reduce overall levels of incarceration and racial and ethnic disparities simultaneously? It seems like that whatever we're doing isn't really working at addressing those twin aims, which are both aims that are motivating people who want to reform the system, right? They don't just want to reduce numbers. People are concerned about racial and ethnic disparities as well. And what I found in some of my other work, actually, looking at, for instance, looking at California, which is considered one of the leaders in terms of sentencing reform. They focused a lot on reforming nonviolent sentences. What I found in that work is that a lot of the supposedly cutting-edge sentencing reforms reduce incarceration, but actually do nothing or actually exacerbate racial or ethnic disparities. So that led me to, what are some other ways, if our current sentencing practices aren't getting the job done, to both reduce incarceration rates overall while simultaneously addressing disparities? What are some other ways to get at this? And this led me to public defense. And I became interested in this really through my wife's work. So my wife is a social worker, and she worked for a number of years with legal aid in New York City. And through her work as a social worker, what she predominantly did was she wrote these mitigation reports where she would get a lot of information on the people that she was serving who were charged with crimes, And she would compile reports that focused on their narrative, that tried to explain how they got to where they were and what the mitigating factors were. And she would find corroborating evidence, so she'd go back to records from their childhood to kind of prove narratives around trauma that often shaped kind of the behavior that was being criminalized. And she would write these reports that would sometimes go to prosecutors' offices and other times to kind of get more lenient pleas agreements, and then also to judges at sentencing to try to get more lenient sentences. And I noticed, well, one, she was putting in a tremendous amount of work. Even at a place that was more resourced, she was working very long hours. But two, that it seemed like anecdotally that she was having successes, but it was hard to determine how much of it was due to the reports. Although I believed that they were important, it was hard to determine that. But it seemed like the work she was doing was mattering. So I became interested in really looking at the role of public defenders and also the people who are supporting them who aren't lawyers, like social workers, investigators, and paralegals, and how their work might potentially address incarceration overall, but also disparities in incarceration. So that's sort of how I got here. So now, with that background on my motivation, I'm going to just get into some other background on why public defense could potentially address incarceration in general, as well as disparities in incarceration more generally. All right, so looking at public defense and mass incarceration, obviously I'm sure everyone's familiar with Gideon versus Wainwright, where states are required, where the Supreme Court requires states to provide attorneys to people being prosecuted who cannot afford them and are facing criminal charges. One real challenge, though, is that the Supreme Court has since interpreted what it means to provide a defense in a very loose way, and has allowed, in many cases, public defender offices to be extremely underfunded and under-resourced, especially when compared to prosecutors. So data suggests, just to kind of illustrate this point, that only 2% of state and local spending on criminal justice goes towards public defense, right? The rest is going towards, generally towards factors that are either trying to get people tied up in the system or that are more punitive in nature. So one consequence of underfunding is that it results in high caseloads, which limit time that can be spent on cases. So in nearly 75% of county public defender offices, attorney caseloads exceed the recommended maximum. There aren't, to my knowledge, caseload recommendations for support staff, so I don't know what the number is about sort of the extent to which their caseloads exceed recommended maximums, but my instinct is that it's quite high. Relatedly, in terms of the extent to which public defender offices rely on support staff, it really varies across locations and often by the size of the public defender agency is what I've read. So in short, for instance, 60% of public defender agencies employ investigators. For other types of support staff, I imagine in some cases for things like social workers, I imagine the percentage is actually significantly lower than that. All right, so do public defender resources impact mass incarceration? So there have been people, we haven't heard it as much as, so there's been like a real emphasis on prosecutors of late and progressive prosecutors as being a potential game changer. And while the noise hasn't been necessarily quite as loud in the national conversation, there are people who have argued that public defense and increasing resources towards them could help reduce mass incarceration and racial disparities for a number of reasons. But one is that the large majority, at least 80% of people who are prosecuted are indigent. So public defense serves a very large share of the people who are actually facing trial. And then people who are Black and of color are also disproportionately likely to be indigent. So that they potentially are more likely to benefit from a more resourced indigent defense system than white people who may be less likely to be indigent. However, for this to be true, reductions in things like caseloads and increases in resources must improve outcomes overall, and they must also improve outcomes for Black and Latinx individuals and do so to a greater or at least similar extent than they do for white individuals. So those are sort of the two conditions that are needed for this argument to kind of hold up and address both the issues of incarceration and disparities. And what I'll show you when I get to the relevant empirical literature is that prior to the study, there was very limited empirical work addressing kind of those two conditions about what would need to be true for this general view that increasing resources for public defense could address these two questions. So most of the literature that's focused on the role of attorneys on sentencing has focused on the type of attorney that someone is represented by. So one set of literature has focused on the difference between public defenders and private attorneys. The results from this scholarship has been mixed. Some finding better outcomes for private attorneys, but others finding no difference between public defenders and private attorneys. The second strand of this is focused on assigned counsel. And there's been more clear evidence that people who are represented by assigned counsel tend to achieve worse outcomes than both public defenders and private counsel. The reason is less clear, but a recent paper suggests that it could be due to assigned counsel, in particular, spending less time on cases than public defenders and private counsel. Throughout this literature, there's little evidence about whether type of counsel differentially impacts different racial groups and addresses disparities. I won't get into too much detail on other attorney characteristics, but in addition to the type of attorney, people have focused on sort of what law school people went into and whether that impacts things, and haven't found consistent evidence on that. There has been some evidence suggesting that when public defenders are paid better, outcomes are better for clients, and that more experienced attorneys produce better outcomes. But that's sort of the extent of the literature on attorney characteristics. Again, this other literature has not addressed racial disparities all that much, or has not found consistent evidence on that. Other relevant literature that's relevant here is holistic defense, which may be particularly relevant because it places emphasis on non-legal needs, such as social services support, which is where in this study, where I'm looking at support staff as well, where they may come into play in particular is on these non-legal needs. Because this approach is relatively new, the research on this is limited. In one of the studies that has examined this in a rigorous way, found that it led to significantly better outcomes for clients when this approach was used. However, this study did not find evidence of it impacting racial disparities. With that said, the authors caution care, and they're pretty cautious about their conclusions on racial disparities because the estimates for racial disparities were quite imprecise, meaning that there was basically a large amount of error around those estimates. So in short, this holistic defense literature suggests to me that support staff could matter, but here it's more about orientation of the public defense and less about sort of the resources available to public defense. So only one study, to my knowledge, prior to me looking into this, had looked at caseloads in particular, and that was a study from 2007. And this study focused on the federal system and found that lower public defender caseloads were associated with better outcomes in general. But there were some substantial limitations to this study that I was hoping to address. First, it only came from 3 federal districts, so it's hard to determine how representative the results were. This study only focused on attorney caseloads, did not focus at all on support staff and their potential contribution, and it did not address the impact of caseloads on racial disparities. So just summing up the prior literature. So what we seem to know is that characteristics of attorneys in defense matter for case outcomes overall. We have less clear evidence on whether these characteristics matter for reducing disparities. And we know very little about the impact of attorney caseloads and essentially nothing about the importance of support staff caseloads. All right, so given that, there are reasons to believe, even though there hasn't been a lot of work on this, there's reasons to believe that these resources matter for sentencing overall. And just the primary theoretical framework that I use, although there are others that also work, is the focal concerns perspective, which basically argues that both legal factors and factors that don't really have anything to do with the facts of the case impact decisions made by judges and prosecutors by influencing their perceptions of offenses and the people who commit offenses with respect to three areas. How culpable is the person? So people who came up with the theory use the word blameworthiness, but how culpable are they for the behavior for the crime that they allegedly committed? How much of a risk does the person pose to the community? And then just judges and prosecutors consider practical constraints, like, for instance, how much space is there in jails and prisons? So given that framework, smaller caseloads could give public defenders and support staff more time to put forth a more thorough defense, which would mean that they'd have more time with clients, and with more time with clients and with being able to put forward a more thorough defense, they may be able to present information in a way that makes clients look, that helps explain culpability and makes them look less to blame for whatever actions they may have committed, and that also makes it appear that they're less of a safety risk to the community. And there are other reasons why these caseloads might matter, but those are some of them. So that's why they should reduce incarceration and sentencing overall. And that's pretty not ambiguous in the theoretical expectation. With respect to racial disparities, the expectations are a bit more ambiguous. So there's reason to believe that they could reduce disparities for a number of reasons. First, we know that judges and prosecutors have biases that impact how they treat people who are charged with crimes. So a strong defense may be needed, especially for Black and Latinx individuals, to counteract negative bias, but may be less necessary for white individuals who may already be less likely to be perceived negatively. So for instance, a judge may be more likely to assume that a white individual has strong community ties, or that the offense they committed was an aberration, whereas a well-resourced defense that demonstrates that a Black or Latinx individual has strong community ties, or that the offense was out of character for them, may be particularly important for changing preconceived notions of judges and prosecutors and juries. So that's why it could reduce disparities, but there's also the possibility that lesser caseloads could increase disparities. One reason is that these negative perceptions that are held by courtroom actors are really strongly held. So a strong defense may not be able to overcome those things, and those biases might remain intact, and just a strong defense might help someone who's white, where the biases aren't as strong, but not be able to overcome biases for Black and Latinx people. Also, some of the tactics that successful defense attorneys often use as mitigation may be more available to white individuals than Black Latinx individuals. So for instance, because of systemic racism, Black and Latinx individuals may have less access to the family and community resources that defense attorneys often highlight. So for instance, employment is one example that's often used to highlight, that's often used by attorneys. And then another reason is that defense attorneys also have their own biases that may lead them to use their greater resources or time in a way that disproportionately helps white people they're working with. And just anecdotally, from some of my wife's work or from people that she's interacted with, it seems like in some cases, support staff are disproportionately assigned to cases where white people are defendants. Again, I don't have data behind that, but just anecdotally, it seems that that might be the case. All right, so just getting back to, based on that theory and that existing literature, what the current study looks at. So it looks at whether public defender and support staff caseloads are associated with pretrial detention, sentencing outcomes, and then racial disparities in these two domains. So I'm happy to answer questions about the data, but I won't get too in the weeds here. But as Andy mentioned, I leveraged this data set called the Census of Public Defenders that had data on cases, the number of attorneys, the number of support staff across different public defender agencies across the countries. And what I did was I linked that to 2 waves of the state court processing statistics data, which is a data source that has data on felony case outcomes for individuals who were charged in large urban districts. And what's neat about it, and what allowed me to leverage this, was that not only do they have where the person was charged, but you're able to tell if they were represented by a public defender, a private attorney, or an assigned counsel. So I was able to basically eliminate people who weren't represented by public defenders and only focus on people who were represented by public defenders. So the final sample consisted of about 5,600 people who were prosecuted in 11 counties in 4 states. So Maricopa and Pima in Arizona, Los Angeles, San Bernardino, Ventura in California, New York City, Nassau County, and Suffolk County in New York State, and Cuyahoga, Franklin, and Hamilton in Ohio. So the key measures, again, just to give time for questions, I won't get into too much detail, were pretrial detention, whether someone was sentenced to incarceration, and the length of their sentence. I looked at this both in terms of the full sample as well as just those who are actually sentenced to incarceration. The key independent variables are the caseloads. So these are the number of cases divided by the number of public defenders, and the number of cases divided by the number of support staff, which again include things like investigators, social workers, paralegals, etc. I talk about race, so I look at these things separately for Black, Latinx, and white individuals. And then I control for the case mix. So certain types of cases require more time than others. So like a capital case requires more time than a misdemeanor case, right? So I account for the percentage of different types of cases that an agency takes on. And then I also control for individual level characteristics like the most serious charge and other things that capture prior criminal history as well as gender and age. So how do I assess this? I use multiple regression approaches where I include all those control variables as well as kind of the key indicators that I'm interested in. I also control for state year fixed effects, which basically mean that I'm accounting for state sentencing policy in that. So I'm only comparing another, not to counties in other states. So that's a way to address sentencing policy differences. As I mentioned, I analyze things separately for Black and Latinx and white defendants. And I then compare whether coefficients are the same or different across racial groups. And then I use listwise deletion 2 as a robustness check, but I use multiple imputation to ensure that I'm not losing too many cases because of missing data on sort of the control variables. So now to the actual findings. So here are the effects or the associations between public defender resources and pretrial detention. And what I find here, all the control variables are included here, but I'm not showing them just for space. The way to interpret this, because it's a linear probability model, is you can interpret these as, for instance, for the Black sample, a 100 caseload increases the probability of pretrial detention for a Black defendant by 25 percentage points. So 0.25 can be interpreted as 25%. The same 100 caseload increase for a support staff person is associated with a 12 percentage point increase in the probability of pretrial detention. We see the same thing for Latinx defendants with support staff caseload significant associations, but no effect for attorneys here. We see also significant associations for the white sample as well, for both attorney and support staff caseloads. However, in this case, for Black attorney, attorney's caseloads, there's a significant difference between the coefficients for Black people who are charged with crimes and white and Latinx attorney coefficients, which means that in this case, reducing Black and reducing caseloads, the results suggest that reducing caseloads would actually reduce Black, white, and Black Latinx disparities in pretrial detention potentially. So in this case, we find evidence that caseloads seem to matter generally across the board and would actually reduce, and addressing these these high caseloads could actually reduce Black-white disparities in pretrial detention. When we look at risk of experiencing incarceration, here we see that across the board, attorney caseloads seem to matter. I don't find evidence here that support staff caseloads matter for the incarceration sentence decision. And we see no significant difference here in caseload coefficients across racial ethnic groups. So what this suggests is that reducing attorney caseloads would lead to fewer people being sentenced to incarceration, but it would not do much to address disparities in who is sentenced to incarceration by race ethnicity. And then in this final analyses, I look at sentence length. The analyses that have full are on those for the entire sample, regardless of whether they actually ended up being sentenced to incarceration. And then the restricted sample are those are analyses specifically the sentence length only for people who are sentenced to incarceration. And here we get very similar findings regardless of the approach, regardless of the sample. And in short, what we see is that across the board, smaller attorney caseloads reduce, or higher attorney caseloads are associated with longer sentences. So smaller attorney caseloads, in theory, could reduce the length of sentences. We see the same thing for support staff caseloads as well. I don't find evidence of a significant effect for the Latinx sample, but the coefficients are quite similar. So I wouldn't read too much into that. It's probably just less precision in the estimate that explains that. What we do see here, though, is that for the Latinx attorney coefficient, the effects are particularly large. So attorney caseloads seem to matter more for the Latinx population than they do for the Black and white individuals, which means that in this case, lowering caseloads for the Latinx population, in general, could actually reduce Latinx white disparities in incarceration sentences, but they would increase Latinx Black disparities. And I did find some evidence here that the white coefficient, at least in the first set of analyses, was actually larger than the Black one. So it actually, paradoxically or counterproductively, while it would help all groups overall, it might actually help, in this case, white people more than Black people. So just before I conclude, I know I'm going a little longer than I anticipated, some study limitations. First, these are purely associations. So even though I'm talking about them in sort of a causal way, I should be careful. There could be other things about these places that could be explaining the associations I observe. Second, the analyses lump support staff together as kind of one group, but don't differentiate between different types of support staff who serve different functions, so they might impact cases in different ways. Relatedly, I can't tell you with these analyses why these associations exist. I have guesses, but I can't tell you why places with more resources or fewer caseloads seem to be having better outcomes. And then another thing is this study was unable to account for prosecutor resources. And it may be that because we have, at least in theory, an adversarial system, it may be that what's more important is the disparity between prosecutor and public defender resources than the absolute level of public defender resources. I'm not sure if that's the case actually, but it could be. It's a possibility. So just summing everything up, given those limitations, I would argue that it seems like public defender and support staff caseloads matter. These resources tend to matter for individuals regardless of their race, ethnicity. So everyone benefits from reducing caseloads. With that said, I think we should be pushing for this. I think public defenders need more resources to do their jobs more effectively, and that would help reduce incarceration. But at least just providing resources may not be enough to dramatically reduce racial or ethnic disparities, and it might vary depending on the outcomes. So given that, there are still a ton of things we don't know that I want to kind of leave you with that you might have insights on or also questions about. So we still don't know how actions taken by staff and attorneys with small caseloads differed from those with larger caseloads. So do they have a more holistic orientation, just more time? Are they writing more reports? Like what are they doing that's different? We don't necessarily know what specific types of advocacy public defense offices with more resources prioritize and should be prioritizing. So how should they best spend if there is an influx in resources? How is that money best spent? Should it be spent on hiring more people? Or is there some other better way to use resources that I'm not aware of? And then kind of, these are all things I'm interested in kind of exploring in the future. And then kind of, and this is kind of a larger question, is there a way to democratize public defense? And what I mean by that is have directly impacted people more involved in the public defender system. And would that lead to better outcomes? So I'm thinking there are some models like participatory defense that focus on getting family members and the community more involved in an individual's defense, but I'm wondering if even more systemically, if there are sort of like things like advisory groups that could be created that provided sort of insights more generally about kind of how to do public defense better. I'm thinking I'm involved sort of in this kind of work on the policing side where there's a lot of resistance because the stakeholders are different, but I wonder if this approach might be more effective in a public defense context where kind of the person that's being served are people who are directly impacted, and that's like the clear stakeholder. So I'm wondering if that could be kind of another way to look at this. So with that said, that's all I've got for you. Thanks so much for your time. Thanks so much to everyone who came and for the invitation. And also, I'd just like to thank the funder of the study, the USC Institute for Research on Race and Public Policy. So thanks so much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Professor Gottlieb. I know I have questions. You left us with some big questions at the end there, and we love those too. So I'm sure there'll be people in this group who either have opinions or thoughts to share. We're a small group, so I would encourage people just to stick your hand up if you have a question, and if you'll bear with me, I'll call on you when I see those hands going up. I'll give you a second to collect your thoughts at the moment. If nobody has one immediately right now, the one thought that I couldn't shake, Erin, throughout the presentation was, I don't know if I fully understood the analyses, but the thought that I couldn't shake was that if public defender caseloads are also correlated with resource levels elsewhere in the system, let's say you have public defenders offices that are relatively well resourced, but also in such a jurisdiction, pretrial service agencies are also well resourced, or I don't know, also prosecutors have more options for diversion because the prosecutors are also more well resourced. Is it possible that the correlations that you see are masking other resource differences in other agencies, which would also account for things like, reduced pretrial detention?
Yeah, it's a great question, and the answer is yes. It is possible. So even though and I should have been more careful in how I talked about it. But so, I mean, I think these provide sort of suggested evidence that there are associations, but for sure, there are other things that could be affecting, including kind of the things that you mentioned, Andy. And one thing I did try to do to at least address some of that concern was by including kind of the state fixed effects, I at least was able to account for statewide differences in like sentencing laws, for instance, which would potentially really affect, for instance, some of these things. So that was one way to address it. But these things within a county or across counties within a state where there are disparities, I wasn't able to address. One, because of issues around data availability, but two, just there wouldn't be enough statistical power to address it, given, unfortunately, just the way the two data sources are. There were only 11 counties that had both types of information that I needed. So I'd run into kind of like a statistical issue, I think, including more things, which is why there certainly is a need for more work on this, for sure.
Yeah, and I should have prefaced that by saying that I think the issue of indigent or public defense resources and its impact on criminal justice outcomes or criminal legal system outcomes more broadly is like so ripe for investigation. I'm just so pleased that you've begun that foray. It's very exciting, particularly I think for people in this group, to sort of even wrestle with the implication that public defense resources has such an important impact on the system as it operates at large, because very often I think that, and you observed about progressive prosecution, I think that defense members of the criminal legal system are framed as essentially the weakest party, and when it comes to pushing reform, very often in this kind of responsive and reactive mode, and so anyway, this idea that the resources that they have might even have such associations is extremely tantalizing. But yeah, right. But I appreciate your thoughtful response about the data. And anyway, I could go on, but I see Meg Ledia. Do you have your hand up?
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to reiterate what you said, Andy. I mean, this is such a great study, but I really see it as sort of like a first pass. Like, so great that you got both these data sets together, that you were able to really look at, even starting to look at, because we've been talking about this, this is what we talk about a lot. And so I think starting that, I work in Texas in Travis County, which is Austin. All this, a lot of states are doing caseload studies right now, or, so people are thinking about like, what are optimal caseloads? And I think, we don't have the data. We don't, in terms of case outcomes, that's not something that we're really have been able to look at. And I think that's something that's really exciting. So it's great that we have Aaron here now, and hopefully you'll stay involved with IDRA, because I know a lot of people on this call are very interested in, continuing to look at that, especially as we get more data.
Just thank you for that, for those comments. And yeah, I definitely want to remain part of the group, and definitely interested in doing more work on this topic with more data. To your point about kind of figuring out what optimal caseloads are, I think from what I gather, the current sort of national guidelines are not, at least from my opinion, it seemed like the caseload guidelines are too high, actually. Like I think I saw when I was prepping for today, I think 200, like the recommended guideline is something like 200 felony cases per attorney. That seems too high to me. And I think other people have sort of made that case. So I think kind of figuring out ideally more reasonable guidelines potentially would be really helpful.
Yeah, so I don't know if you're aware of it, but there's these Delphi studies that a lot of states, they have been sort of working, but and maybe somebody from TIDC wants to talk about that. But it's sort of looking at what do attorneys think is optimal. And I think that's really the best way to start, because we don't have the data on outcomes. But I think there are a lot of people in this group in particular that would be really interested in seeing what it looks like with outcomes, right? So like we start with, well, what do attorneys think that they need to work on this kind of case? And they did timekeeping studies, and then they had these expert panels come in and say, well, this is too low or that's too high, or never too high really. But and so I think then going from there and thinking about, well, what does that really say for case outcomes?
Yeah.
You know, and how do those link together would be, obviously that'd be awesome.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting.
But we can send you some of those studies too, so you can just see what people are talking about.
Great, thank you. That would be great.
Cynthia Lee, I know, has actually done a weighted case law study, right, Cynthia? I wonder what your question is.
Yeah, actually, so I wanted to make a comment just following up on what Meg said about the Delphi studies. A lot of these studies ask very specific questions about how much time do you need for particular activities, or in the case of the ones that I've worked on, which activities do you need more time for? So that if you look at those studies, you'll get information on at least what attorneys think those extra resources should be devoted to. And in my experience, it tends to focus on activities early in the case, fact investigation, client contact, to really build an understanding of the case. And in the studies that I've done that have also involved support staff, the attorneys are saying that typically they're saying more than additional attorneys, we would like to have investigators and social workers, because they can very efficiently get at some of those things you're talking about. That those advocacy pieces, painting a picture of the client as a whole person, that the attorney can't necessarily do as efficiently herself. So you're going to get, like Meg said, this is going to be the attorney's opinion, but you can get some pretty good detail out of some of those reports about what activities the attorneys think are important.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Yeah, I definitely, I would love to see that work to learn more. I think that is a good way to, it's a very good starting point to thinking about that issue, right? Because who would know better than the people involved in the actual work, what they need and how time could be spent. So I think that's great.
I just want to relay to the group that in the comments we've had several interesting points where we have at least one request for your slides, Aaron.
Yeah, happy to share.
Thank you. Yes, I mean that would be easy to distribute to the group if you want to send them to me, or we can try and connect you with folks directly. Mike Tartaglia has a nice point raising the fact that there are some standards for sort of ratios. That's really neat, Mike. Thank you for sharing that resource. And Wes Shackle from TIDC has shared the case law study from Texas.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Do we have anybody else with questions for Aaron at the moment? We've got about 8 minutes left, so certainly time for a couple more. Aaron, you know we're really comfortable with long silences in this group. This is this is how things go.
Yes, I did want to actually. So I saw a question in the chat real briefly about kind of the slide on crime rates. So yeah, they're not necessarily. So they're standardized to show the trends, but they're not necessarily on the same scale, right? They're made to look so you can observe them. Because if you looked at, for instance, can pull it up, but and I can share it. But if you look at kind of, yeah, so motor vehicle theft is kind of multiplied by a factor of, or divided by a factor of 2. Obviously, homicides are much less common. So it's just trying to make it on the same scale so you can compare the things, but really the thing there, or the point in the slide is less about the absolute levels and more about kind of the trends, which aren't affected by that scaling. So it's just kind of, yep. So that's basically exactly, Ben. So it's indexed. Thanks for saying that more concisely than I was trying to.
Yeah,
Andy, I have another question.
Sure.
go for it.
So I was wondering, do you have a paper for this? And if so, in the paper, do you talk about what the caseloads you do see are for those different public defenders? Like, do you know what the range is? Are you seeing?
Yeah. Yeah, so there are two kind of relevant papers that I'm happy to share out. And we do talk about I do talk about the numbers. I would say, and this is another limitation that I perhaps didn't articulate as well, and one of the limitations of sort of doing analysis in the aggregate rather than with individuals. So these were like county level measures I created. So I don't know, for instance, like when I'm looking at an individual's case, I don't know like what the resources of that specific attorney were, like what their caseload was. And I don't know which support staff worked with them, for instance. What I do know is the average in that office or in that county. So that's what I'm using as a proxy because I don't have the individual level data to get at that. But I do have numbers and I can, let me look. I can, yeah, so that is, so you can, so those are some of them, and I can send out real quick. I can get those specific links to them. One of them actually is easy to access and not behind a paywall.
Yeah, I'm just wondering because like this assumes that it's linear, right? So like you're having a linear relationship between caseload and outcome.
Yep.
But it's possible that like it's not linear, that like really
100%.
high caseloads are really, really bad and like medium case, you know what I mean? Like
Yep.
that's something that just as we get more data, obviously we can start looking more at. But I was just curious to see what that spread was to see sort of, but I'll look at that later.
Yeah, so this one is the paper in Race and Justice, and this one anyone can download. And I can see real quick, I'm not sure if it was in this paper or the other one where I provided that info. Yeah, so this table, it appears that, is this for, sorry. So the cases per attorney ranged from, the average was about a little over 400. And the average for support staff was in the 600s. But there was a substantial range ranging to, I believe, something like 200 for attorneys to like 700 for attorneys. And then something like maybe like 400 or 500 for support staff to like close to 1,000. So there was a substantial range. I don't have the exact numbers there, but so your idea about trying to look for a nonlinear association, I think, is important. And one I didn't do, one that I think just given the small number of places would be hard to do with this data, but that with better data that maybe you all are collecting could be something to really look at. And I'm happy to send you the other paper where I actually have those numbers that's behind a paywall. I can just send it to you, or I can send it to Andy and he can just distribute it so that people can look at it.
Awesome, thank you, and thanks, Meg. Yeah, I mean, we've got 3 minutes left, so if anybody's got a burning question, please do stick your hand up. I want to highlight the contribution in particular that you're making to looking at disparities, Aaron. We in our field, there's been a lot of work in relation to the question of caseload and reducing them and having enough time. The idea of thinking about the relationship of that to the way that people make discretionary decisions about actually allocating their effort to cases, and then the actual outcome when comparing different groups of clients in terms of the disparate impact on outcomes, is something that's actually much more rarely considered. would stand corrective if any of the folks involved in that work want to set me straight on that. But I think that that's a really interesting comparison, sort of point of analysis and framing. We actually pretty rarely see in literature on indigent defense and public defense. So I think that's a really nice just sort of issue to raise, that at least in the context of these sort of caseload conversations is I think usually in the background rather than the foreground. So I think that's a really neat and distinct contribution that you're making also.
Thank you so much. And no, I really appreciate that. And I do think that, yeah, that we want to do both. We want to reduce the punitiveness and also make sure that that all groups are kind of benefiting in a way that's reducing the disparities we know that exist. I do also want to kind of reiterate that I really kind of appreciate the questions and the comments, and I would love to talk with people offline or after this is over. So I hope to kind of keep in touch and learn more about what everyone else is doing and talk to more people about this work and other work that they're working on that's related. So.
Absolutely. I'm certain that will happen naturally. Aaron, if you want to send me any material, I'll be happy to distribute to the
Sure.
group. And I hope and expect that people will follow up directly. We do like to respect people's time. People always naturally sign off when we come up to the hour anyway, and I see that that's what's happening. So I just want to say thank you to you, Aaron, for taking the time to share this with us. We really are an interested group in this work, and we really appreciate it. That you took the time to share your insights with us. It's been very enriching. So thanks so much.
Thanks so much. And I really appreciate the invitation and just the time everyone took. And just before, Andy, before you sign off, I just want to make sure I download the resources that people sent. So
oh yeah. No, we'll hang about for a couple minutes.
Everyone else can sign off, but just please don't I want to make sure I have the resources that were sent.
Yeah. Yeah, right. We've got several things here.
Oh, let me just email myself so I don't forget.
Yes, we've got the TIDC caseload study piece there, and then
I also some people sent some private messages too. So
oh, great! Oh, terrific! Yeah, the I don't think Mike Tartaglia gave us the sort of citation for his ratios, but I've seen these before.
It's useful to know, even if I'm sure.
Yeah, Mike works at the Sixth Amendment Center.
Oh,
so yeah, right. Yeah, so you might be able to just track him down there.
Just taking the notes.
Yeah. I'm not sure if he's referring to sort of national standards or if he's collated them from different places.
I also want to say I've read kind of your work on kind of the state level stuff.
Oh, really?
I found that very interesting. So.
Oh, cool! I'm so glad. Thank you for saying so. Yeah.
Wanted to let you know that. Yeah.
Yeah, I was very involved in an earlier life with some of the reforms that were beginning at the time in New York, but now are really underway. And thinking a lot about what the resource injection would mean in that state.
Yeah. Awesome. I've got it now. So.
Awesome. Cool. Well, this was great. Thanks again. I mean, this actually happens what happens very rarely to me is that as a person who's interested in doing research in indigent defense, every now and again, but fairly occasionally, a new name pops up, and that's what happened with yours. Like, we're kind of a small community, so most of the time, like, the same old people. So the moment that somebody comes up, and everybody always has a personal story. I was fascinated that it was your wife who was sort of in the profession already, like that. There's very often a connection like that. But every time a name pops up, I just want to grab that person and be like, join our little cult, like, you're welcome.
I so appreciate it, and I look forward to kind of attending the future talks, and yeah, so I really
yeah, absolutely. I don't know, are you actually on the mailing list? Because we
I don't believe so, or maybe I am, but I definitely wasn't before.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I mean, it's not an overwhelm. It's not. It doesn't come out every day or something like that. It's just every now and again a message comes out. So if you don't mind, I'll just stick you on it, and then
I
you'll
would
be in
love
the
that.
loop.
I would appreciate that.
Awesome, great, okay.
Great.
Well, it was really terrific to meet you, and
Yes, likewise.
thank you again.
Thank you.
And yeah, I'm sure we'll be in touch.
Yeah, sounds good. Take care, Andy.
You too. Bye bye.
Bye-bye.